So the first of our themes is emotion, the most romantic, right, of all the subjects we're going to be talking about. And I picked out a few pieces that I think help encapsulate that use of emotion. We're going to start out first with the artist Gros, and Gros is famous for being selected by Napoleon to be like an official painter for him. So a lot of what Gros did was political propaganda for Napoleon. Now, Napoleon, you don't know a lot about him, right? He comes into power in France after the fall of the first French Revolution. It'll take, right, multiple tries, right, for the French Revolution to actually work out. So the first French Revolution, rising up against Louis XVI, does not work out for the French people. So Napoleon comes into power and names himself emperor. One of the things that Napoleon pushed for was expansion, colonialism, going into places like Africa, Turkey, various other locations. So his project was expansionist. It was colonialist. And what Gros is painting here is a situation that arose from this colonialist impulse. Napoleon's troops had gone to Turkey, and people had started to fall ill with the bubonic plague. The bubonic plague was most famous, of course, in the medieval period. It was called the Black Death, and it killed about two-thirds of the population of medieval Europe. So if you've heard about the bubonic plague, you probably have studied it in the context of medieval culture. But it had reared its head again here, right, in the 1800s during the Romantic period, and was infecting people in this area of Turkey called Jaffa. Now, bubonic plague is spread by rats and is pretty much fatal. It's a really nasty, right, way to die. Um, it's really quite awful. So basically, it started to kind of filter back to France that the plague was getting out of hand in this region, and Napoleon made the executive decision to basically poison everybody in this area by poisoning the water. If you kill off the people, you kill off the plague and you could contain it. He also, though, however, poisoned his own soldiers, his own French soldiers. And again, you can understand perhaps why he made this decision to contain the plague. But at the same time, if people find out about it, it's not going to look that good for his image. So eventually, word started to travel back to France that he had poisoned the people in this area and also his own troops. The families of the troops start to find this out. There starts to be a lot of turmoil in France. So he commissions Gros to paint this piece, which I often peg as one of the first pieces of like political spin that I encounter in the modern era, let's say. This reminds me of like a politician getting on TV and saying, I didn't do that thing, right? So Napoleon had Gros paint this vision of what happened. And in this vision of what happened, notice that Napoleon travels to Jaffa and is meeting with the afflicted locals, um, and caring for them in a sense. You'll notice how he reaches out his hand like he's going to touch one of the sick people, all while his aide is sort of cowering behind him with a hanky to his mouth, right, to protect himself. And so Gros was using this painting to elevate Napoleon's status, make Napoleon look like a kind, caring leader, and definitely not somebody who just went and poisoned, like told his people to go poison everybody. So this to me functions as political propaganda or spin. It's a very emotionally charged piece. Like what's to believe, right? If you believe this vision, you see this great protector of people, this great healer of people, right? That's what you see. And so Napoleon wanted Gros to pull and push on those emotions, in order to cover up, right, his real actions, right, during this plague outbreak in Jaffa. Um, and I would say, if you think about this painting, there's no way this really happened. Napoleon never would have went anywhere near a plague. Why would you? It's all hype, right? It's all meant to look like he's this great guy, but let's face reality. There's no way that this ever would have happened. So it's purely romanticized in nature. It's purely emotional in nature. And if you think about the other themes like the exotic, you'll note that the locals are sort of all in stages of half undress. Again, almost sort of pointing to their primitive exotic quality, while the French are in their full military regalia. We're inside of a mosque, right, an Islamic mosque. So there's a bit of hint of exoticism there because the French were Catholic, right, Christian Catholic. And so kind of contrasting the religion of Muslims, right, against Christianity, that would be sort of an exotic note that would be hit here. But again, this is a piece that's meant to be romanticized, emotional, sort of speak to this character of Napoleon, right, as this caring, compassionate leader when, again, we know that he basically just had them all poisoned and sent to their death. Here's another image of Napoleon that I think speaks to the romanticizing of him. And notice who we're encountering. We're encountering David. And as I noted about David, he was very quick to switch patrons if it suited his needs. He started out painting for Louis XVI. So if you go back and look at the Oath of the Horatii, that piece was created to basically convince people, hey, you should stick with the king, right? You should stick with Louis XVI. You should stick with the monarchy. Then, of course, Louis XVI loses his head, so David starts painting for the revolutionaries. I didn't show you this work, but you could look up Death of Marat. That's a famous one that David painted when he was working for the revolutionaries. And then he's imprisoned when the revolution falls and fails. And Napoleon supposedly comes to see him in his jail cell and is like, hey, so I heard you're good. You want to come paint for me? And David was like, yeah. So David to me is a man of opportunity. He sees when opportunity is knocking and he goes where his opportunities are. So he starts painting for Napoleon. Napoleon in this painting, I think it's just the height of like romantic style. So notice David straddles neoclassicism and romanticism. He actually paints in both camps. And this piece, everything's heightened, everything's theatrical, it's very emotional. It makes Napoleon look like this grand, over the top theatrical leader. So, again, it's not a neoclassical piece, right? It's a romantic piece. I love the drapery, the cape swirling around him, his gesture, the horse rearing up. And this piece deals with Napoleon leading his troops over the Alps. Down on the stones, it's cropped out, but you have the names of Bonaparte, right? Napoleon Bonaparte, Hannibal, Charlemagne. So other leaders who had gone over the Alps with troops. He's sort of pulling from their heritage. So David, he takes Napoleon and makes him into this grand over-the-top leader. If you look at all these Napoleon paintings, one of the things you might notice that he actually was a short guy, but the paintings you could never tell. So that's romanticism too, to me, like kind of editing out what's inconvenient. And, Napoleon didn't want to look short. So, I'm sure he told his painters, hey, make me look like I'm a tall guy, right? And again, that's romantic. You can just edit it, to how it suits your emotional needs. Even in this piece by Ingres, you'll notice he has his feet kind of on a little stool. I'm a short person. I'm about 5'3", and I'm always struggling with chairs because most chairs are made for people who are like 5'6" to 5'9"-ish, and I'm 5'3", so I always have this problem with chairs where like half the time my feet aren't hitting the floor. Napoleon, I'm sure, had the same problem. So he has a little footstool here, right? So his feet aren't kind of like, swaying in the breeze. But again, it's all about this romanticization of the setting and the scene, right? Kind of editing out what's inconvenient and making him look really good. And I always look at this piece and I look at him as this grand, romantic, exotic peacock. Sort of over the top leader. He's wearing his coronation robes. They're all spread out. And again, he ends up looking like this sort of, romanticized character. I also wanted to show you the works of Goya to speak a bit about emotion in art in the Romantic period. Goya is a Spanish painter, and we've not seen a lot of Spaniards, so you're getting one here, right? And Goya was noted for working for the Spanish court, so the King of Spain and his family. And then later on, he sort of turns more inward and actually starts to fall to sort of a madness. Many people link his madness to his deafness. He started to go deaf. And so many people believe that what happened was is that because he was going deaf, he couldn't hear people. He had a harder time being in the orbit of the court because court politics were all about socializing and chatting and talking. So he probably started to feel very alienated and very alone. So I'll show you his black painting series. And many people talk about that's after he began to go deaf and he sort of started to go inward on himself. But he starts out sort of painting for the court. And this is a piece that's very, very famous that related to the court of Ferdinand VII, um, where this isn't like the king and his family looking good, but this is about a political struggle that happened in Spain. Ferdinand, as king, was said to be pretty weak. Like he didn't really understand how to govern very well. And so it was noted that Napoleon kind of reached out to Ferdinand and said, hey there, my fellow monarch. Maybe France can help you out. Maybe France can come in and help you kind of get your state in order, your country in order. And Ferdinand was like, yeah, that sounds good. I'd love to have the French come in and help me kind of learn how to manage my country. Now, anyone who knows Napoleon should know this was a pretty big ruse on Napoleon's part. Because once the French soldiers arrived and were there for a while, Ferdinand was like, okay, well, I think we figured all this out, thanks. And the French were like, no, we're just going to stay. So if you know Napoleon, you shouldn't have, basically taken his help, I always say. But Ferdinand, again, he seemed to be a very weak king if you look at his history. So this piece actually represents the people revolting against the French occupation, where the people started to realize that Ferdinand had made a bad bargain and that the French weren't intending to leave, that they were just going to stick around. And they revolt and they're trying to shove the French troops out of the country, and it goes very badly, obviously, for them, as you can see in the painting. So what this painting documents is the slaughtering of the Spanish citizens by the French soldiers. And I love this painting. I just think it's very emotional. It's very theatrical. It's got a lot of atmosphere to it. And it does something I think the emotionalness of Romanticism is meant to do. It almost like punches you in the stomach. It has this visceral feeling to it that you can't deny. So I love how the painting is set at night. So it looks kind of scary and gloomy. Everything's scarier at night, I always say. If you watch horror movies, there's a reason why they're usually at night. If you're watching a horror movie set during the day, you know it's pretty good because it's hard to be scary during the daylight. But the atmospheric nature of the nighttime scene, and then you get this almost like Baroque, spotlighting effect right on the main character. But it's like a timeline if you really think about it. It's the past, the present, and the future. The man with his arms up is the present. He's saying, "Don't shoot me." The past is the people coming up the stairs, and then the future is what's going to happen to all of them, which is they're all going to be gunned down, they're all going to be slaughtered. And notice that in a romantic painting, they don't hold back on the blood or the gore. They want to really, again, strike you with this emotional, like, kick to the stomach almost, like this visceral, like, ooh, oh my, what am I looking at? They want to make that happen in you, that emotional reaction. So, where to me in a neoclassical painting, they probably wouldn't go very heavy on the gore or the blood. They would think that's unrestrained. Here they're like, yo, get that blood in there. Like, make sure it's really clear how gory all this is and how emotional, all this is. Go with it. But I love this idea of a timeline of like past, present, and future, and we know what's going to happen to the figure. Many people talk about how the figure is almost like Christ-like. And if you go back and look at Napoleon in the Jaffa painting, people say he's almost Christ-like. He's reaching out his hand like he's going to touch and heal the sick. Here, this figure, there's the bright highlight of him and the white shirt and the yellow contrasting with everybody else in kind of darker colors. And then his hands are kind of out almost like in a cross shape, as if he's about to be crucified or sacrificed. So again, there's a lot of symbolism that you can kind of read into the emotionalness of these pieces. The final element I love is the French soldiers, because you'll note the French soldiers have their backs to you and their faces, you can't see them. And we think Goya did that very purposefully, where he made the soldiers these, nameless, faceless people that you can't identify with. And then he made the Spanish citizens all very individualized and emotional, and we want to identify with them. So I love this contrast of like you don't want to know the soldiers, but you want to know the citizens. You want to feel what they're feeling. So it's a masterful work, right, of Romanticism in my mind. But unfortunately, as I mentioned, Goya did start to lose his bearings a bit due to his deafness, and began to lose a lot of commissions and lose a lot of the court support that he had. And so he turned to painting more personal works, more works for his own reasons. And the black paintings are part of that work he was doing, the series of work he was doing. Many of these paintings appeared on the walls of his home. So he would paint directly onto the wall using fresco paint. Um, and often they were in parts of his house where, sort of like, oh my. Like the Saturn devouring his children supposedly was in his dining room. So, he had like a dark humor kind of running through these paintings. Saturn devouring his children actually is based on Greek mythology, where you have the idea of kind of a misnaming here, where like he's really not referencing his mythology quite correct, but in the Greek myth, of course, you have Kronos, right? Basically, he was swallowing his children so he could contain them and control them. And Zeus is the child that gets away, and ends up being the head of the Olympian gods when he comes back to overthrow his father. Um, what Goya does is really just amp up the gore and the horror of that original story. Again, you're left with this kind of reaction looking at these paintings, where you almost feel like you're in a horror movie. Something quite dark and dramatic and twisted is happening. The Colossus piece reminds me of like Godzilla, like this huge monster, trampling through the countryside. Witch's Sabbath, like the things that we can't understand, the black magic, the darkness that, some people allude is out there. He's really playing with, again, these sort of forbidden topics. And again, these are things he was painting for his own reasons in his home, for his personal edification. So he's not trying to please an audience when he's making these kind of works. Goya was also very, very famous for his prints. We talked a little bit about printmaking with Dürer, so you understand the process through that conversation. And as I mentioned there, printmaking is all about cheap, affordable art making. You want to be able to get it into as many hands as possible. So Goya was very political, and he liked to use printmaking because he felt he could speak to a larger audience about the concerns he had about Spain. And one of the main concerns he had, especially at the end of Ferdinand VII's rule, is that there was no reason, there was no true leadership. Everything was falling apart, and that he felt that his country was being misled, this country was being mismanaged. And so this is one of his most famous prints, The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters. So as the person sleeps, as you have the bats and the owls and the cat, they represent folly, they represent treachery, and, this idea of ignorance, right, and arrogance. And so the animals are meant to signify the lost path, that as reason sleeps, these dark things come out to play, and all that can change it is man waking up and taking control. He also did prints against the war that was raging between France and Spain, and commenting on the horrific things that were happening. So I love the title of this, Brave Deeds Done Against the Dead. And it's a title that's meant to be tongue-in-cheek. This idea that you're killing people, but then you're going so far as to dismember their bodies and do horrible things to them. That war is dark enough, right? When people act in this completely inhuman, disgusting fashion, what is one to think? So he was like, what is this war doing to us? And one of my favorites is the critiques he did about education and religion. I'm not going to share any of the religious pieces, but again, you can search around and find some of those. They're pretty good. He had a lot of problems with the Catholic Church, and he had a lot of problems with education and how people were being educated. As a professor, I love this piece because I think it speaks to something that has been a struggle for a lot of educators in recent years, which is like the automation of education, the using of metrics and rubrics and outcomes driven, data driven stuff to the point where people don't care about like what you're actually learning. They care about like the data of outcomes. How many people are passing your classes, how many people aren't, where if you try to talk to administrators about, look, I can give you a narrative on each of my students and how they're performing, and why they're not succeeding, why they're not doing well. They're like, that's nice. I just want to know the numbers and I just want the numbers to be higher. And it feels very alienating as an educator where you don't really care about my students really learning anything. You only care that I prove they can pass. Like, even if they're not really doing their work, like that doesn't make any sense to me. And this idea that, there's lots of standardized testing, there's a lot of rote memorization, but not a lot of like critical thinking or deep thinking skills that people seem to want us to teach. So here you'll note that it's called Education is an Ass, and they're all donkeys. If you think about the noises that donkeys make, they bray. Like, yeah, I'm not a good donkey impersonator, but you get the point. And the idea that they're learning the alphabet, but they're just kind of probably saying the letter over and over, and it just sounds like braying at the end of it all. It's all just meaningless. What does it matter if you learn what an A is if you don't learn that, you have to put it together with other letters to make sounds, to make phonetics, to make words that have meaning. So he was very much saying, does education have meaning, or is it just this memorization or roteness? And again, I think it's something we can reflect upon in the current educational moment. At least I definitely think so, based on my experiences of late. So, again, as a professor, I quite love this print and think it's pretty fun, right, to consider. So, again, I love Goya's works. I think he really plays with emotion, but in this kind of directed way, a political way. Um, and, again, he would paint for the court, so he'd paint for like high level patrons, but he also took great care to make things for a more common audience as well, like the prince. I also wanted to show you one last artist, which is Delacroix. We ran into Delacroix when thinking about, a painting should be a feast for the eyes. And you can look at a lot of his works, but this is his most famous, Liberty Leading the People. Delacroix was a French painter, and he was very involved in the second phase of the French Revolution, which managed to stick, right, and work out for the French people. So what you're seeing is the allegory of liberty, holding what would become the French tricolor flag, which it still uses today, but it was the revolutionary flag, surrounded by the various classes of the French citizenry. And she's sort of calling them to arms, telling them, come with me, fight with me, and you will be successful. Again, it's pretty emotional stuff. The setting is very emotional. You have the smoke of the city in the background, where people set fires, and you have the dead strewn across the ground, right, that they're marching over. And I love the emotionalness of war, like the fact that someone has taken one of the guy's pants. Like, he's dead, he doesn't need his pants, right? The gruesomeness of the reality of war is what a romantic painter would try to show you, right? The reality of that situation. I mentioned that she's an allegory. We talked about the allegory before, that it's a personification of an abstract concept. You saw them with Bronzino. And that's why she's bare-breasted. She's basically suggesting, I'm not a real person, I'm the emblem of liberty, right? I represent liberty to you. Then you'll notice she wears this little red cap on her head, and then below her there's a figure kind of crouching at her feet with another little red cap on. The little red cap was a symbol of a freed slave in French society, someone who had earned their freedom from slavery. And so the allegory of liberty is sort of an emblem for, like, everybody being freed from the tyranny of the monarch. And then again, the freed slave at her feet mimics that idea. It's a really beautiful kind of connection. The people to her left and to her right represent the three classes of French culture. On the end, you have the worker, who has the sword or the scabbard. He sort of looks dirtier, right, like a working man. You then have the aristocracy. A lot of people are like, is that Abraham Lincoln? I'm like, no. But you get the point of what was in fashion at that time, right? So we're looking at like, mid 1800s, and what would be fashionable is what, the Abraham Lincoln look, I guess. But the idea of the aristocracy, he holds a much more expensive weapon, the gun, right, the musket. And then to the other side of liberty, you see the young street urchin, the poor. And you might say, well, he has guns too. Yeah, he probably stole it off that dead guy with no pants. Because he was a resourceful young lad. He always reminds me of like Oliver Twist, right? The little street urchins of Oliver Twist. But the idea that the three classes of French culture, that she's unifying them all together to fight under the banner of revolution. Now, is this really true? It's a romantic painting. You can say whatever you want. I doubt the aristocracy was out there like, oh, get rid of the monarchy. They know their place. They know that their privilege comes from the king. So I doubt that, the French aristocrats are going to be out there fighting. But again, it's meant to be a romantic painting. It's meant to be like stating an idea and a principle in a very, very emotional, right, over the top kind of way. So this is a really great painting about romantic values, but I also think it helps us understand the trajectory of the two different revolutions, Napoleon's reign, and kind of the timeline from the beheading of Louis XVI, right, to the formation of the French Republic. And that spans from the end of basically the middle of the neoclassical period to the end of the romantic period, as far as France's transformation, let us say. So again, a very important work to study when looking at romanticism and emotion.